Hello, good evening. This is Sarah Rovner with FullThrottle Aviation. As I mentioned, I was going to put together a live video. I had to deal with some of the permissions on my computer, but I finally just got it to work. So I'm ready to kind of talk about my career path and how I came to be with both the airlines and with FullThrottle Aviation, and answer any questions that people may have regarding a career change, ferry flying, or even airline flying. I am going to put the disclaimer out there that I'm not a recruiter for any of the airlines, and that everything that I say is representing myself as an ATP and an airline captain, and not specific to any airline in particular, but I'd be glad to answer any questions that people may have. So to start out, I figured I'd maybe give you a little bit of introduction of how I got to be where I am. So I had a little bit of a different path than most people would have. I went into the military when I was 18. I learned a very valuable skill set while I was in the military, which was IT work. It's something I'd been doing for a while before the military, but I actually had something to put on a resume after the fact. And so I got out of the military, became a network engineer, started working full-time doing that, and it gave me a lot of opportunities to make enough money and pursue a hobby that I found, which was aviation. So my introduction to aviation was as a hobby and not as a career pilot. And just like many other people that I know, I was the pilot that, flew on the weekends or on weekdays after work, sometimes even taking a long lunch. And I never really had any intent to become a career pilot. And if you talk to a lot of people that are ferry pilots or, do some of these odd jobs in aviation, most of them never grew up planning to do that. So I'll kind of tell you how I got to that point. So I started working as a network engineer. I put myself through training. My private pilot, that was done at a local flight school, local Part 61 flight school. I paid as I went. I didn't make nearly as much money at the time, so a lot of my private pilot certificate was actually put on credit cards, and I had to work after the fact to pay that off, pay as you go. And so I obtained my private pilot certificate at a local flight school. I did my instrument rating through a flying club. It was I wouldn't quite call it, it was mostly an equity flying club, one of the ones where you put a significant deposit down and share in the expenses. I did my private through there, or not my private, but I did my instrument through there, as well as my commercial. And then my CFI I did through another flying club, which was down in Pearland. And so a lot of the flying that I did after my private was done through flying clubs, where I hired private instructors to train me. So I didn't go through a Part 141 school or anything like that. I didn't go through ATP. I just kind of paid as I went, which was kind of a good option, because in a lot of these equity flying clubs, or a lot of good flying clubs in general, you have the opportunity to rent planes and receive instruction for a fraction of the cost as, let's say, going through a flight school. But obviously, if you go that route, there's really limited financing options. You can't use your GI Bill for it and everything like that. So that was the path that I took. I obtained my CFI, my multi-engine instructor, and I started doing that as a hobby. And so I'm sure that people have heard me before, but FullThrottle Aviation started out as a flight school. I created my own syllabus for private and instrument, and my intent at the time was to get planes, put them on lease back, have instructors. And I realized really, really quickly that it was a lot of work, as I'm sure many of the flight instructors and flight school owners know. It's a lot of work in order to get any type of return on investment. And so the way that I got into ferrying was I got called by a man here who lives in Houston, or lived in Houston, and he was relocating out to Las Vegas. And I had a reputation at the time for flying old Tailwheel airplanes. I had the Cub, and so he said, well, would you fly my Citabria out to Las Vegas? And I leaped and I did it. And I had cross-country experience because I had been flying a 182, either that I rented or owned, out to different plant locations down in Louisiana, Georgia. I flew the plane as far north as Denver. And so I had a lot of cross-country experience. And so I jumped in the Citabria and I flew it across the country. My very, very first fuel stop, it was having backfiring of the engine. So it's almost a joke between ferry pilots, because we know that we run into a lot of maintenance problems on a ferry flight. So my very first one, I landed in Brownwood, and the engine was backfiring. So I pulled it back into the FBO. Luckily, there was a mechanic there who knew exactly what was wrong, and they pulled the spark plugs out there, and they were so fouled, and that was obviously the reason why, and he was able to clean them right there on the spot. So that was kind of an interesting experience. My very first ferry flight, maintenance delay on the very first landing. So I got on my way, delivered the airplane. I said, wow, this is actually kind of fun. I get to travel the world and see new things. My second ferry flight was a Cessna 175. I had a student at the time that bought a Cessna 175 out in Show Low, Arizona. And I was going to be his flight instructor for his private pilot certificate. And so we went out to Show Low together. Well, we went into Phoenix and drove up to Show Low. And then we got on a plane and we flew it back to Houston, where I continued instructing. The third ferry flight, and probably the biggest break in my connection down to Belize, was I got a call from a friend within the community here in Houston asking if I would take a Canadian crop duster. There was an airplane located in Canada, all the way down to Belize. And I said, wow, man, Brazil, that's pretty far. He's like, no, Belize. Nobody really knows where the country is unless you've been there and or have a really good idea of geography. So I said, well, I'll do it, but I'm kind of afraid. I don't really want to take it down through Mexico. So I did the ferry flight. I took it down from Canada down to Houston, and I was going to swap out with another pilot because I was too afraid to go. And so he knew that I had flown crop duster type airplanes before because I'd been towing gliders over at the local soaring club in the Pawnees. So I had experience in those kind of planes. So I jumped in the ag truck, flew it down to Houston, but the other pilot wasn't able to complete the ferry flight. So it kind of once again fell on my lap to complete the second half. And so I jumped into it, flew all the way down through Mexico, back in a time where it was very, very different a few years ago. It's changed a lot. You can use credit cards now to pay for fuel. It wasn't always like that. And so I jumped in this plane and I flew it down to Belize, and that was technically my third ferry flight. It says, you know what? This is pretty cool. I'd never done anything like it before. I got to, experience different cultures, and I said, well, I think I'm going to try doing more of this. So I started doing a little bit of jobs here and there, and then another break that I had is I had the opportunity to fly a Super Viking up to Alaska. And so I got in touch with the owner of the plane, and we went up there together. He ended up leaving the ferry flight because he had to be back in Alaska. And if anybody's ever flown the route to Alaska, they know that the weather just isn't amazing for most of the way. And so the weather isn't that amazing. And so he ended up leaving, I believe it was in Edmonton. Yeah, we took the Super Viking into Edmonton International Airport. And so he ended up going, I took the rest of it solo. And that was one of my biggest ferry flights up to that point. And so that's kind of how I got started into ferry flying. I kind of fell into it as a way to make a lot more money than being a flight instructor. And I realized that it was a lot of fun too. And so the company slowly grew. I added more people who worked for me. We got involved in all kinds of different airplanes. And now we have 19 active pilots flying planes all over the world. We've taken them as far east as I'd probably say Italy is probably the furthest we've gone. And then, down south as well, down to Central America. And so it's been quite a wild ride. And I know that, my path has been very different than a lot of people. And the kind of flying that we do, it's just all over the place. It's not just, taking a 182 from here to there. We often jump into planes we've never been in before. I tell people that my first time in a turboprop was solo. It was in an Air Tractor 502. And there's only one seat in the plane, so you can't get checked out in an Air Tractor 502. And my first landing wasn't the best, but by the time I got a few landings under my belt, it definitely was much better. So, we do this weird operation. I've taken single engine planes now, I think a total of 7 times across the North Atlantic. And so, and I hate to say it, it never gets easier. You're always still nervous when you're taking them across. So now now that I've kind of talked about, how our business has grown, I know that people have a lot of different questions, and I'd be glad to answer those. I see from James, thanks for doing this. You're afraid that's something new. I have some questions that I got yesterday that I figured I would kind of address. So from Robert, it says, how did you survive taking that pay cut to go instructing full time? I'm barely bringing enough home for gas and food, it seems. That right there is kind of a common question that I get. So while I was working as a network engineer, as you can imagine, the pay is a lot better than being a regional airline pilot or even as an instructor. And so it's kind of a very difficult transition that I did. I knew I've always been pretty good with being able to forecast and get a hold of finances. I had to downsize. You know, I couldn't have a car payment. I drove a 1999 Jeep. Well, I still have the Jeep. It's now in pieces in my garage. I'm going to fix it just when I get around to it. But, you know, it took a lot of sacrifices. I knew that I wasn't going to be making as much money. I rented out rooms in my house, which was, if anybody else has ever done that before, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. So I rented out rooms in my house. You know, I started saving all my money. I didn't spend money on anything. You know, I downsized with the cars. I put a lot of money in savings because I knew that, well, you know, for a few years, it was going to be pretty bad. You know, I mean, you know, network engineers, you're probably making, you know, everybody who's a network, well, most network engineers make over 6 figures. And so jumping from there, and when I first went to the regionals, they didn't even pay $30 an hour. And now I think the newest pay package is like $50 an hour. So that's significantly higher than when I started. But, you know, there was a big pay cut. And so what I did is I had to put myself in a position, now mind you, not the most comfortable position, but I had to put myself in a position where I knew I could pay the bills. And I did that by renting out rooms, you know, not driving fancy cars, you know, saving money wherever I could, packing food to go to work, as well as, you know, doing as much flying as I could on the side. And so, you know, when Full Throttle Aviation first started, I mean, it just like any small business, it takes a while to take a business and make it profitable. If anybody here has ever started a business, then you kind of know the struggle. You know, the first few years, you know, you're doing everything you can to try to break even, and oftentimes even taking a loss. And so the first few years of having my business, it really wasn't that profitable. I hadn't figured out what worked and what didn't work. I didn't really understand the market and what the market would bear. And it took a lot of time. And really the profitability came with the international kind of flying, because, you know, I'm sure that everybody knows there's a lot of competition for time builder jobs right now. Aviation's doing really, really well. And so when I took the pay cut, it was with the expectation that over an extended period of time, I would be able to make that money back. And so that's exactly what I did. Is I took the pay cut, I lived off savings, I rented out the rooms in the house that I had to pay the mortgage, you know, and had to deal with other people living in my house. You know, I drove an old car around, and eventually, as the pay went up with the regionals, it started paying for itself. Right now, most regional airlines are upgrading in under 2 years. Realistically, if you get the flight time. And so, you know, the captain's salary is obviously a lot better than the first officer salary. And so within, you know, a few years of making that jump, you probably would make enough money to afford a mortgage and have a decent car. As far as people who are looking to time build and make a jump from their day job, that's kind of a hard thing to do too, because you know, the day job obviously is going to pay a lot more. And how on earth are you going to build all that time? What I did is I did a lot of instructing and ferry flying. And one thing that I found was that it was difficult to do ferry flying with, in conjunction with a day job, because a lot of time the trips were, you know, a lot of time the trips were 3, 4, 5 days, especially the international ones. And I found that it just really wasn't working with my schedule. And so the only thing that you could probably do in that situation is kind of, you know, I was able to work out something where I had, you know, a little bit more time, block time off, you know, with my boss. And the other thing about my particular career field is they do allow telecommuting. And so I was able to work from home while building some of that time. The other route you could go is also the instructor route if you want to keep your day job, or you could do what a lot of people debate and just jump in. You know, go to ATP and try to knock out all your flight time, your ratings as soon as you possibly can, and then make the jump. But regardless, there's going to be, unless you are, you know, unless you are insanely rich on your own accord, which I say insanely rich because it is aviation. If you start out with $1 billion, you're going to end up with $1 million. It's going to be difficult, and there's going to be some sacrifice that you're going to have to make. You know, right now I get to do all these cool things, but in reality, I'm home about 3 to 4 days a month. And so that's not really a lot of time to be home. And so people with families or other commitments with children, it might be a little bit more difficult for you to get into something like ferry flying because it requires so much time away from home. And most aviation jobs do, until you get to the more desirable jobs, which are generally for more experienced pilots where you're home more. So that's kind of the path that I took from, doing my day job to flying full time. It took me, from the time that I started flying, I got my private pilot's license in 2011, to the time I went to the airlines was about 4 to 5 years. And so, I know that all these programs like ATP, well, you can get to the airlines in 2 or 3 years, but I did it part-time. I never became a full-time instructor or a full-time time builder. And, to this day, ferry flying is still part-time because I have other commitments as well. So that's one way of doing it. Let's see, next question. Yeah, I think Brian just asked the question that I answered. Are you away from your family as much as I imagine you are? Even if I got the pay cut, not sure I can handle being away from the kids. This might be a fun option when they grow up. Definitely. With the airlines, you can probably work with your schedule more to be home, but being a ferry pilot, if you want to make a living at it and you want to build a lot of time with it, it is going to require a lot of time away from home. I found that the demographic for most of the people who do ferry flying, usually they're single, which is pretty common if they're young. They might be in a relationship or married, but we don't really have many people who have young kids because, they take a lot of time and, the family's an important part of their life. So we either have time builders who are usually young, just came out of flight training, who are building time to go to the airlines, or we have a lot of retirees. So, I call them empty nesters. There's people who love aviation. They own their own airplanes. They got their commercial pilot certificate a long time ago. And now they're finally at a stage in life where, hey, this would be kind of fun. And it is. It's a lot of fun. I mean, how many people can say they've flown the fjords of Greenland? Or, they've flown over volcanoes in Iceland? Or how many times I've flown small planes to Alaska on a crystal clear day? Not many people can say they've had those experiences, so it's a lot of fun. And so we have a lot of people that have had other careers. One of them, I've had a retired police officer or, a retired, Silicon Valley engineer. And so we have a lot of different people that get into this, but usually the demographic is, either the young time builders or the people who have completed the family stage of their life and now they're ready for more adventure in their retirement. And I mean, when our pilots age in range, we have, all the way from 19 years old up to, I believe, 80. And so as long as the pilot makes good decisions and they hold a first or second class medical, then, there's no reason that they could not ferry fly. So we kind of have it all over the board. But generally speaking, people with young kids at home don't start into this career. Because, ferry flying, as much as the international stuff is challenging, it's still very much a time building job. It's still the majority of ferry pilots flying in the United States do it to build time. Now, and I'm not saying build time just to the airlines, but they use it to build time to go on to their next big, the next step in their career. Let's see. Can you make a full-time career out of ferry flying? Domestically, what are the minimums employers are looking for? You could make a career full-time. I know several pilots who do that. Mike Bradford's a very experienced pilot. He's one of them. He flies, full-time Cirruses, mostly over to Europe. There are some ferry pilots. I know of a few in the United Kingdom who've done it. There are full-time ferry pilots, but many of them, after 5,000 to 6,000 hours, they end up giving it up. And I'll kind of talk about why that is. Ferry flying, in the grand scheme of things, I don't want to say it's the most dangerous thing you can do as a pilot, but it's probably close to it. Right behind crop dusting, of course, anything low level would probably have a higher risk. But, ferry flying, if you get into the international market, the money's really, really good. I know ferry pilots who make, $10,000, $20,000 a month, ferry flying. Now, most of that is international. The problem with the domestic market right now is that there's so many people who are trying to do it. And, I'm a big fan of competition because, that wouldn't be fair. If we said that, this is the only computer people can buy, well, then I can charge you $10,000 for the computer and there's nothing you can do about it. So, I'm a big fan of competition in the industry, but there are so many people out there who are offering services for not much money, to offering their services for free, that it's really, really hard to compete in the domestic market and be able to make a livable wage. And so a lot of people don't end up doing domestic ferry flying because as a flight instructor, they'd likely make more money. That being said, with anything, you know, if you are a doctor, right? If you specialize in cardiac, if you're a cardiologist, then you're likely going to make more money than somebody who's just well, I don't want to say that for sure because I'm not a doctor. But if you specialize in something, you're likely going to be able to charge a premium for that particular service. And so, you know, if you have a specialty within aviation, such as tailwheel, maybe agricultural aircraft, you know, if you have, you know, air tractor time or, you know, turbine time, you know, if you're into that, or let's say that you specialize in King Airs, or if you specialize in experimentals, or whatever it may be, then you are likely going to be able to make a career out of it. But if all you can fly is a Cessna 152 and a 172, the problem is you've got thousands of other pilots with about your same flight time who are all competing for the same time building jobs. And so, you know, you say, what are minimums are employers looking for? When I get resumes from people, I look at a few different things. And for all of you who have sent resumes to people, I'm sure you probably heard that the employer generally only looks at your resume for less than a minute. And I can say from firsthand experience, that's usually the case. I look at the responses to the questions, if there is one, a cover letter, and the resume. And that entire process takes maybe 1 to 2 minutes. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for anything that would show me that you have experience relative to the job position. And when I say that, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for any type of either life experience or flight experience that's going to show that you're capable of handling long-range flights. So, you know, if all you've done is fly around the traffic pattern, you know, for 250 hours, and your cross-country time is, you know, the minimum of 50 or 60 hours, well, that's going to probably tell me that in order to get you to the level of being able to handle long cross-country flights, you know, starting out with maybe, you know, outside of the Rockies, or maybe, you know, if you want to start out, you know, with flatlands or whatever it may be, it's going to take a lot of time and money in order to get you to that point, which is not always a deal breaker. You know, if people have really good judgment and life experience and they've flown interesting airplanes and they have, you know, if I feel like they'd be a good fit for the team, then yes, we're willing to invest in them. If people generally don't meet the minimums that we're looking for to start them out right away, we oftentimes invite them to our internship program, which allows them to gain cross-country experience in order so that whenever they gain enough experience, it'd be safe to go on their own as a full-time, well, not full-time, but as a full ferry pilot for us. Our minimums are just the regular commercial pilot minimums, 250 hours, which is a United States requirement. So if you or if you did 141, then you probably might have less than that, but our insurance requires 250 hours. But what we really look for is if you've flown any, you know, a bunch of different airplanes, if you have any tailwheel, complex, high performance endorsements, or if you have a lot of good cross-country experience. And that's kind of what we're looking for when we look for new pilots. But in the end, I mean, I always tell people that, you know, we look for good people and not necessarily the best pilots. I can sit there and teach somebody how to land a Super Cub. Well, most people I can teach how to land a Super Cub, and but we can't always teach people good judgment. So what we really are looking for is people who are going to be good pilots, who are going to work hard, who are going to do the right thing, who are honest, and who aren't going to be causing any problems. And we look for those people, and we choose to invest in them in order to come on. Now you're saying, well, how on earth do I show, you know, somebody on a resume that you're a good person? I tell you this: persistence. And I know you've probably heard that before. And people said, oh, well, you know, show up at their doorstep. Well, maybe don't go that far, right? But, you know, when somebody just, you know, says, hey, you know, hey, I'm putting my hat in the bag, you know, I want to be a ferry pilot. And, you know, I just, you know, if they don't even go into any details or anything like that, I just think, oh, well, they're really not that serious. But, you know, we had one of our ferry pilots that would email me once every week or two and ask if there was any openings. And at first I thought, oh, this is, you know, this guy doesn't really have any experience. And then I realized, wow, you know, he's really committed. This is something he really wants to do. And we brought him on the team because of that. So, you know, if you show that it's something you really want, that you really care for, and that you're willing to put in the work, sometimes we make exceptions and we'll give that resume a second glance. Even if you're not the most experienced, Turns out that some of those people are the best people. Let's see. Been flying for almost 4 years and have commercial multi-engine instrument with 850 hours. What is a competition like for someone like me in ferry flying? I can do part or full time. So it depends. It depends on what type of ferry flying you're trying to do. 850 hours is not a small number anymore. You know, everybody knows that 850 hours, depending on how you got your license or how you got your ratings, you know, you're only probably 6 months to a year away from getting an airline job. And so that's not a small amount of hours to have. If you can specialize in something, let's say that, you know, you have 850 hours is what I would consider a high time pilot, you know, for ferry flying, at least domestic ferry flying. But if you have, out of the 850, you have, you know, 500 tailwheel, well, you know, definitely you'd be extremely competitive to do it. At 850 hours, you're probably insurable to meet open pilot warranties in a majority of customer airplanes. Even the super complex high performance stuff. You know, I flew a P-Baron the other day. If you have 750 hours of total time, you're insurable in that aircraft. And so at 850 hours, I'd say that you're highly competitive, because most of the people that are ferrying domestically, I would probably say have less than that amount of time. So I would say that you would be competitive, but definitely you would still need to find a niche, because an 850-hour commercial pilot is still going to be paid the same as a 250-hour pilot to fly the same airplane on the same route, because that's what the industry will bear. So unless you have a specialization, you know, the amount of time that you have won't really help you in this field. From Raleigh, can you describe the learning curve of the process of importing and exporting aircraft? Describe the learning curve. Well, I learned the hard way. You know, it's something that I didn't really understand at first, but after, you know, having issues on a few of them, I kind of realized what needed to be done. It's not as difficult as people think that it is, but you got to make sure all your paperwork is right. So I had to hire people the first few times I did it before I understood how to do it myself, or how to, you know, prepare a lot of the paperwork and everything like that. So if you want to get into that international business, my best recommendation would be to, and if you want to avoid the headaches that I've been through, and I've got stories, my best recommendation would be to hire somebody who knows exactly how to do it. And then once you understand the process and get comfortable with it, and you develop a relationship with the different customs offices, well, then at that point, you'd probably be okay to start doing it yourself. Because every customs office is different. I can tell you exactly what they want down in Harlingen, or Lake Erie, or Boeing Field, or Milwaukee, which are a lot of the common ports that I use. I can tell you exactly what they want, and everybody's different. So until you kind of know the ropes, it's probably best to hire somebody that does. Let's see. What is your experience with customer relations with ferrying? The relationship with the customer and pilot skills balancing act. Customer satisfaction is a big part of ferry flying. The unique thing about ferry flying is that unless you're going to be ferrying for a broker, or, you know, a factory, or a repeat customer, a lot of the customers you're going to get are going to be one-time people, or they might come back to you in 10 years from now. So it's a little bit different, because you're not looking to develop a long-term relationship with the customer. But out of ferry flying, I've actually met some great people along the way that have actually become my best friends that I talk to on a daily basis. So it allows you to get exposed to a lot of different people. Just with any commercial pilot job, there's always a balancing act. You know, there's a lot of pressures in ferry flying, especially, I hate to say it, but with agricultural customers, because, you know, they know that every day that the plane's not flying, they're losing money. Or, you know, a lot of times there might be time pressures, or it's got to be out of the hangar by this time of the month, or whatever it may be. And so trying to find the balance between making the customer happy and doing something that's safe, it can often be kind of challenging, because oftentimes as a ferry pilot, you're getting hired to fly the plane because of a few different reasons. Either, you know, the owner doesn't have time, which that thing that they say could be a variety of different things, about things I'm going to name. They might not be qualified to fly the plane. You know, we've had people who bought tailwheel airplanes who don't have a tailwheel endorsement yet. And so, you know, they might not be qualified. They might be intimidated by it. You know, I know a lot of pilots who won't fly over water. You know, I mean, some of my customers who I delivered the single engine planes to in Europe, they were extremely accomplished pilots, extremely competent, but they weren't crazy like me and willing to take the plane over the water. And so those are just a few of the reasons that we get that. And so that being said, a lot of times the customer might not really know what you're up against. I have sat there and given prognostic charts and grommets to customers in Europe, and they don't really understand that. They don't understand, you know, the forecast, the North Atlantic stuff, and everything like that. And so trying to explain it in a way they understand is good for customer service. But in the end, you have to do the right thing that's safe and not necessarily what the customer wants. And unfortunately, that's just the way it goes. And some people will never be happy with the explanation that, hey, I couldn't fly on that day. But in the end, most people are very reasonable, and they kind of, they come to the conclusion themselves that, hey, getting my airplane here safely, you know, a few days behind is better than not at all. Let's see. Any other questions? Yep, Charlie, 750 hours in Cirrus, SR20, and 1,100 total hours. You'd be very competitive because, you know, there's not a lot of people that fly Cirrus. The interesting thing about Cirrus is that the insurance companies kind of govern that aircraft quite a bit. And a lot of times they want CSIPs, which is the Cirrus Certified Instructor Program, to do a lot of the ferry flights. But if you have a lot of experience in type, you can often get insured to ferry a Cirrus aircraft, or even, you know, or even instruct in one if you're a CFI. Let's see, would you say that most ferry aircraft are agricultural or more common GA planes like the Cessna 172? This was kind of an interesting thing because I actually did a statistical analysis of the type of airplanes we flew. And as much as, you know, I think, wow, man, all we do is fly tailwheel airplanes, we actually found that the kind of airplanes we're ferrying are very in line with the percentage of that type of aircraft. So even though I didn't think we were flying a lot of nose wheel 172s or 152s, it turns out we are, because they're common. So if you say, hey, you know, in the real world, 1 to 3% of airplanes are agricultural, and, you know, 10% are Cessnas or whatever it may be, you will find that the kind of airplanes you're getting are going to be very representative of the kind of planes that are out there. That being said, I'd probably say that there are a lot of 172s, but a 172 is an aircraft that most pilots will get experience in their lifetime. And so if it's a 172, you're likely not going to run into issues with the owner not being qualified to fly the airplane. So that's going to rule out a lot of your different ferry flights. Agricultural probably accounts for a small amount of the ferry flying. There's still a lot of it out there, but it's still a fairly small amount of the ferry flying that's done overall. Let's see. How do you assess whether or not the airplane you're about to ferry is safe? And can you talk about your scariest experience? Well, without implicating anybody, let's see. Airworthiness is a big part of our jobs. We're not requiring our pilots to be AMPs, but we prefer to have pilots that have some mechanical knowledge. We've found over the years that, you know, a lot of airplanes that haven't flown in a long time, we find a lot of issues on those planes. And so we have a policy that if the plane has not flown in 6 months, it has to be test flown. And we will charge the customer a fee if we have to test fly it, but we encourage them to fly it themselves. Airworthiness, you know, a lot of times we study the logs. The logs have to be available. We look, you know, for example, on an airplane that I flew recently, I compared the logbooks and the 337s with repairs that I found on the airplane, and I wanted to make sure everything matched and that there was nothing that was on the plane that wasn't in the logs. And when you got a plane that's, you know, over 60, 70 years old, well, it's a lot of work. So we usually do that ahead of time, or sometimes when we get to the aircraft. We have a policy with our pilots that we will not question their judgment. If you go out to the airplane and you say the tire, it just doesn't look right to you and you don't want to fly it, we will not question your judgment. We will never second guess you. You know, if you don't feel like it's safe to fly, then don't fly it. There is no harm, no foul. And, you know, we'll get the pilot home safely, and I'll deal with, you know, usually what comes out to be an unhappy plane owner. But in the end, we got to do what's right for us with our certificates and not embark onto shady ferry flights. And I was talking to somebody, actually, I think I was in Iceland. I was talking to another ferry pilot, and he said that ferry pilots have a reputation for being cowboys. Transport Canada has been cracking down on ferry flights outside of Canada to Europe because pilots have had a bad reputation of installing unapproved ferry tanks, flying really shady airplanes that aren't airworthy without the right paperwork, and it's commonplace. It has been commonplace for so long. And so when you want to be an operator that does the right thing, it's oftentimes still hard to break out of that mold. But we really do not encourage people to fly airplanes that are marginally safe, not legal, or whatever the situation may be. And we have lost jobs because of that. But in the end, we've got to determine that the plane is safe and then go from there, because it's our lives and our livelihood on the line. Scariest experience. I've had a total of 4 forced landings, 2 on airport, 2 off airport, and 2 of them occurred on ferry flights. So I was test flying an airplane down in Florida and had some issues with the engine and made an emergency landing on an airport. That happened on another ferry flight. Coming out of Houston, I had some engine problems. It turns out it blew 2 cylinders, and I put it down on an airport. So, that is a possibility. I'm trying to think if, scariest experience. I've had quite a few of them. So, yeah, probably my scariest experience I've ever had in an airplane was the forced landing at night. Shortly after I obtained my private pilot certificate, I experienced a nighttime engine failure in a Cessna 172 and landed on a road. I hit power lines and everything. Unfortunately, the airplane was damaged, tore up the wing pretty bad, fuel leak. And so after that experience, the NTSB determined, they took the engine apart and determined that it was failure of the rear crankshaft gear dowel pin due to improper installation, resulting in a total loss of engine power. That accident was early on in my career. It was something that made me consider whether or not I wanted to stay in aviation. It was, quite traumatic, as you can imagine. You're not quite sure of the outcome. And it really got me interested in aviation safety, both from a mechanical standpoint and a human factor standpoint. And shortly after that, I became very involved with the FAA safety team. I'm now a FAA safety team lead representative, and I do a lot of work in aviation safety and human factors to try to, help other people that might experience the same thing as me. Let's see. I want to fly over the ocean. How do I get started? I tried. I'm just going to put this out here. I tried for years to get my first turbine job and to get my first oceanic job. There was so many times that I got so close. I had done all the planning for years before I got my first break. For years. I got turned down. I went to Air Tractor every year. I went to, I tried, getting my way into that industry. But considering that I didn't have anybody that hired me that already did it, it was dang near impossible to break into that industry. And my big break came when I had a customer who wanted somebody to fly with them across to Europe in a King Air. And he had crossed before, but his insurance wanted 2 pilots. And since at the time I had a lot of experience down in Central America, I knew about customs and I knew exactly who to talk to in Greenland. I knew all of them. I had all the flight planning tools. And I said, how about this? I will fly right seat with you and I will handle all the paperwork. And it's going to be cheaper than hiring a handler. And you'll pay me the same amount as you would have a handler. And I'll be a CFI and we'll go across there together. And that was my first break into the oceanic industry. The next few crossings that I did, I acted as a CFI, handling all the paperwork and all the weather. And I finally, after I got about 3 or 4 crossings under my belt, I started doing them solo. And so it took a while to get to that point. And so being a CFI and having the international and paperwork experience, I consider myself to be a paperwork pilot because I love paperwork. I just get excited when I go to FedEx. I just sit at the printer and I get excited. So that was kind of my in and how I got into the oceanic ferrying. And then from there, as the experience grew, I experimented with different routes across. I finally went to all these different airports in Greenland and Iceland and Canada. that's kind of how I got to be where I was now. But it took a long time of, you know, flying south of the border and doing paperwork and trying to prove my qualifications before I got my break. By the time I finally got my first break with an air tractor, I had over 1,000 hours of turbine time and, you know, quite a bit of tailwheel experience and quite a bit of time in smaller ag type planes. And, you know, I mean, it just took a lot of persistence and trying and having jobs fail because somebody talked them out of that. And to this day, you know, every single leg that I did in the 502, the seller would text the owner and ask him if I had wrecked it yet. So, you know, not a whole lot of faith that people have, but, you know, it took a long time to get to that point. And after that break, it's a lot easier once you finally get that first job to continue working toward that. How are you able to get so much time off from your 121 schedule? So, you know, I do balance aviation and, let's see, I do have to balance aviation and airline flying. Everybody knows that. I'm very public about it. At our airline, we are specifically allowed to fly outside of work. The reason that I have a lot of time off is because I got into the training department at my airline. And so the training department accounts for a lot. It's kind of complicated how the schedules work, but being in the training department gives me a lot of credit, and therefore I can bid down on my schedule. And of course, when you're junior, none of that works. I mean, nothing works when you're junior. And, you know, one thing that people might not know about me is that even though I have, and I can actually hold, you know, being based where I live, I choose not to. And instead commute, which is a nightmare if anybody's ever done it. And I commute and chase seniority around. So I just switch bases and chase seniority around, because having a lot of seniority allows me to get higher paying work trips and work less overall. So I hate to say it, but if you're thinking about doing this with airline flying, seniority is the answer, because that's the only way you're gonna get it. As far as staying legal, I always make sure, you know, I don't really fly as much with the work. I have been flying a lot more with work now, but as long as I treat ferry flying as if I am doing part 117, I always limit the amount of flighting hours that I do and make sure there's never a conflict. And I actually keep track of all of that. Let's see. Brian Turner, pull the chute. That's exactly how you land a cirrus, by the way. I watched the video and it was extremely informative. And I felt that after watching Brian's video that I could successfully land the cirrus with a parachute. Let's see. Who would buy a plane they weren't already qualified to fly? You'd be surprised. And people ask what's the cheapest way to get to commercial aviation. Well, owning a plane is fairly cheap in the United States. It's not in Europe. It's not down in Central America. But a lot of people do buy airplanes that they aren't qualified yet to fly. You know, a lot of times it's just a technicality. Like, you know, they bought, you know, they want to get into bush flying or backcountry flying, and they buy a Super Cub and they don't have any Super Cub time. So, you know, that happens quite a bit. And one of the services that we offer as a company is allowing one of our pilots, usually a CFII, to provide instruction for you on the ferry, or even stay after they deliver for another 3 or 4 days to, you know, train you in that airplane. Let's see. I'm looking through the comments. Who loves EAPIS? Actually, it's pretty good here in the States. You don't really have that in a lot of other places. The rules are just different. In some countries, you have to have a permit to land, and you have to send all the paperwork for the airplane ahead of time. Like Belize is one of them. You have to have a permit to land in the country of Belize. Let's see. How does your scheduling trip system work? Are your ferry pilots employees or contractors? So our ferry pilots are contractors. And what usually happens is I try to keep it based on seniority, but I also look at geographic location, and I also look at their experience. So if I get a call to say, hey, can you fly a Super Cub from New York to Florida? Well, I'm gonna look first and say, okay, who's on the top of the list? Are they qualified to fly a Super Cub? And how close are they to either the destination or the pickup point? Because, you know, obviously it's going to be a lot more expensive to travel somebody from Seattle to go fly a plane in New York than it would be to find somebody who lives in Ohio and take them to New York. So we do it based on geographic location, as well as their capabilities, as well as their schedule. So we have several pilots that don't have 5 days off in a row on a regular basis. And so if the ferry was a lot longer, we wouldn't be able to use those. So normally what our pilots do is they update their calendar and their qualifications. And when we have a job that meets that, then we would ask them if they're available for the job, and if they accept, then they would accept, a particular pay rate for that job. And we would then arrange for their tickets. We'd purchase their tickets to go out there to pick up the plane. And that's usually how that works. Let's see. How can a new commercial pilot start ferrying? Kind of what I hit on earlier is that a new commercial pilot, depending on what you've flown, you're going to be limited to a certain type of aircraft. And there's a lot of brand new commercial pilots out there who are itching to put their certificate to good use, who don't necessarily want to be a CFI. And I'm of the impression that, okay, I'm not like one of those people who says you got to pay your dues. But that being said, if you are a CFI, that is going to open more doors. But if you just have a commercial pilot certificate and you want to get into ferrying, my best recommendation is to try to fly as many aircraft as you can, as many different aircraft as you can. Because if all you can fly is a 172, you're going to be competing against tons of other pilots who want to do that. So my best recommendation is to fly as much as you can. And when you find somebody that you want to work for, be persistent. Don't give up. Make it so that if that's what you really, really want to do, show them that. I get so many requests from people who said, oh, this would be kind of fun to do on the side, but they don't really, they're just doing it because they're bored. They don't have a passion for it. We personally look for people who are passionate, who want to be part of the family. So be persistent, gain as much experience as you can. Those are probably the two best pieces of advice for people who want to get into that. Let's see. What are the minimum credentials? I talked about that. Our insurance requires a commercial pilot certificate with instrument rating. We have been able to get the instrument rating requirement waived in the past. That's mostly for agricultural pilots flying agricultural type aircraft. How many aircraft have you flown? I've now flown 117 different types of airplanes. So that's kind of a lot of different airplanes and mediocre skills in most of them. So it's a great experience. Let's see. I got some more questions here. Let's see. How do you know when you're ready for a plane you've never flown before? This is probably one of the questions I get the most. Planes you've never flown before, yes. If you've ever flown an agricultural airplane, you'll probably notice that there's only one seat. One time I was talking to another passenger on the airline, and we were talking about the smallest planes we'd ever flown, and she said, well, I've flown one plane that only had one aisle on each side. The other person was like, I only flown an airplane that had 8 seats, and I was like, I once flew a plane that only had 1 seat. And if you were in the plane that you had to fly it too, and she's like, was that on American or is that on Delta? I started laughing. I was like, it was a crop duster, because most crop dusters only have 1 seat. And so you can't really get checked out in those types of airplanes. And there's other airplanes that are like that out there, a lot of aerobatic airplanes, a lot of experimentals might only have 1 seat. And so generally what we do before throwing somebody in a plane they haven't flown before is we make sure that they have experience in something similar, or they have a lot of experience in a similar type of operation. And we have to be really, really careful in the conditions we let them go in. So personally for me, like I wouldn't jump into a Pitts, because that's an airplane, even though I've got, quite a bit of tailwheel experience, a lot of experience, that's kind of a plane that you need to be checked out in. Steerman's another one. I wasn't willing to jump into Steerman solo, and I had to go out and do a checkout. It took me about 4.5 hours in order to get checked out before I could fly the Steerman solo, and that's being a high time pilot. So if it's something like that, well then, that's, we definitely want to get you a checkout. Now, I started flying, I have a Super Cub. I fly a lot of Super Cubs. Well, Husky is a similar aircraft. And so I was able to transition from the Super Cub to the Husky without a checkout. And that's a similar type of airplane. If, you've been flying Super Decathlons, well, if you've been flying a Super Decathlon, you can probably fly a Citabria. If you can fly a Taylor craft, you can probably fly, a Champ. And so we look for airplanes that are similar, and we then make a determination on whether or not you would be okay to jump into that airplane based on pilot experience. And I tell you this, I don't fly air tractors nearly enough. to be really, really confident in a variety of conditions. And so if I get into a plane that I haven't flown before or a new type of airplane, I really limit the conditions that I take it into. I mean, I don't go if the winds are strong. I will avoid landing with, if I can, with more than a 5 or 10 knot crosswind. I avoid gusty winds. There's a lot of different things that you can do to mitigate the risk if you're flying into a new type of plane until you can get comfortable with that airplane and that type of airplane. Where can you learn foreign airspace rules? I always make the joke the hard way. Most countries, if they're a participating member of ICAO, they're very, very similar. And of course, IFR is going to protect you anywhere. What I have done is I have contacted people, word of mouth, a friend of a friend in each of these countries in order to determine what the requirements are. And you could pay a handler to do it for $700 a leg, or you could make local contacts. And so at a lot of the airports that we go to, down in Central America, and even up in Canada, we know the people there. And we've made contact and, given out fun meters or, whatever it may be on previous trips. So we've established kind of a network. And if we go to a country we haven't been before, we use the same method. We try to contact local people. And if we can't, then unfortunately the only option at that point would be to hire a handler or risk going down there and not filing the right form or stamping the right form and then having a bunch of issues. So that's kind of what we do. A lot of people are talking about the scary moments on ferry flights. I'll have to do a separate video and tell some stories about it. Can you come fly the Cub? I don't advertise, instruction in my airplane, but I will on occasion do it for friends. Let's see. Mountains, if you've had no mountain experience. So this is another thing that we kind of deal with a lot. We have a lot of pilots that have never flown in the mountains before, and now they have to, take an underpowered airplane over the mountains. And so what we normally do is for all of our pilots, we will pay for an upset recovery course / mountain flying course if they choose. Because I feel like upset recovery is an important part of mountain flying because you can end up in conditions that are bad. Other than that, usually on their first mountain ferry, we have them go with one of our other pilots so they can get experience, usually an instructor. Otherwise, if it's not like extreme mountain flying, then we will go over, I will hold a session with them, instruction, and they will receive ground training on mountain operations. But 90% of the time, their first time over the mountains is not solo. They go with one of our other pilots until they kind of get used to that. Is it better to join a company or just put yourself out there? That's a tricky one. The thing is, a lot of people just don't know where to look. I talked to customers, they said, we didn't even know something like this existed. And so if you're just, Joe at the local airport saying, hey, yeah, I'll deliver your plane for you, it's going to be hard. You probably will get some business, but it's going to be hard to get a lot of business because a lot of it is still word of mouth. Or if you have a really good website that, is one of the top ones on Google, exposure is everything. When it comes down to marketing yourself as a commercial pilot, the more connections that you can make, the more network that you have, the more successful you'll be just on your own. But usually people start out working with the ferry company so they can understand and learn the rules, learn flight planning in a safe environment. Because I tell people that ferry flying is very little stick and rudder. I mean, out of the hundreds of hours I have on all these planes, I hardly have any landings. I take off, I fly for 3 or 4 hours, and I land. I get 2 landings in a day. And so, it's very, very little about flying, and it's more about decision making. Most of the ferry pilots that have suffered accidents or the ditchings in the North Atlantic, it was always decision related. It was fuel exhaustion, performance, weather, all these different things that can get you when you're starting to cross a lot of different boundaries. And you have to look at more than just TAFs. You have to understand weather in a way that you never thought you would. You have to understand, microclimates, phenomena, what the wind does. There's all kinds of things that go into it. And so a lot of times it's a good idea to start with people who've done it before so that you don't learn your lessons the hard way. How does insurance work for ferrying? So depending on how you want to do it. So we have an insurance policy that covers, it's a secondary insurance policy, obviously, to the owner's policy. But we have an insurance policy that would cover our pilots and the aircraft while we're flying it. But most non-owned policies, even commercial non-owned policies, do not cover things that happen beyond our control. And so we always recommend that the owner insures their airplane, because if a fuel truck drives into it while it's on the ramp, then that's not something our insurance is going to cover. But our insurance does cover us for our liability if something were to happen while on a ferry flight, which is a good selling point, but even more so, it protects our pilots and protects us as a business. How much tailwheel float time would you recommend before taking those jobs? That's a personal minimums question. There's no way to know until you get in that. I remember I've gotten in some tailwheel airplanes and I thought that I could handle it, and they just took me for a ride. And so, fortunately, knock on wood, I've never ground looped or damaged a tailwheel airplane. That doesn't mean that I'm invincible or not capable of it, because I'm always just 1 second away from ground looping or going off the runway. Always. You always got to think of it that way. It's all going to depend on the pilot. Usually, I look for 100 hours of tailwheel, because at 100 hours, you've probably had good, come to God experiences where you almost wrecked. And that's what I'm looking for. I tell people that when I sign them off for their tailwheel endorsements, that I want to see their bad landings. I want to see them bounce. I want to see them start going off the runway. Why? Because that's going to happen in real life. There's going to be a landing, you're going to land, and it's going to take you for a ride. And I want to know exactly how you're going to recover. And so my thing is, a lot of people can land a tailwheel airplane and they get, 4 out of 5 greasers. But what happens on that 5th one? That's what I need to see. And usually for me, the threshold that I know that you've had some hairy landings, because I'm looking for the hairy ones, I'm not looking for the good ones, is about 100 hours. Is about the time where you've had enough dangerous landings and been able to recover that you would be comfortable now ferrying somebody else's airplane and being able to recover when things go south. Because they will, and it's going to be up to you to save it at that point. Let's see. I already talked about the maintenance. Ferrying really is a good way to build time. You're going to build a lot of time real quick. And usually, money is, the money is actually pretty good if you get into the international stuff. I keep buying airplanes. Why do I not have any money? It's probably because you keep buying airplanes. I can tell you that firsthand. I finally just, upgraded from my 1999 Jeep, but I remember one time I'd landed and my friend was like making a joke. It's like, wait, you have an airplane and you drive this? And I was like, there's a reason I drive this, and it's because I have an airplane. Let's see. It's the best way to practice checking in over the radio with your position for non-radar environments. My first oceanic crossing, I was so excited. And I was like, okay, I got to learn how to do these position reports. And believe it or not, I flew with the captain. I was a first officer at the time at the airline, but I flew with the captain who had actually been to Greenland before, and he had done oceanic flying with the military. And I practiced my position reports with him, like not over the real radio, but, I started practicing with him for those. And I also had it written down to kind of help me, know exactly what I needed for those. And I also try to set my iPad up or whatever GPS is in the plane with a way that gives me the data that I need, like with the next points and the times and everything like that. So you can do those 2 things to kind of help you out. What scares me the most? Maintenance. Maintenance scares me the most. There's a lot of good mechanics out there, and there's a lot of bad ones too. I don't want to, throw anybody under the bus, but, you got to make a judgment call. You go out to an airplane. Even you go to your local flight school. How many of you guys have gone out to your flight school and wondered, well, is this plane going to be safe for me to fly? How many of you has actually refused a plane that you went out and pre-flighted? You have to think about those things, right? You as the pilot in command are ultimately responsible for determining the airworthiness. The logs can be perfect. The plane can look good and you can still have issues. It's just, it's just how things are. You can minimize that risk by, taking, really good care of the airplane and looking it over really well. But in the end, you have to make a determination. And that determination is going to be what's going to dictate how the flight's going to go. And so, my best advice there is, really get a good idea of the plane and possibly test fly it if you don't think that it's 100% where you want it to be. But yet it's still safe. Having an A&P in the background, of course. If you're an A&P, that's going to be a valuable mechanical experience. An A&P is going to see things on a plane that a pilot's not, because they've probably worked on those parts. You know, it's kind of like I can almost, after working on my cars, I can kind of tell by looking at cars or looking at the engine bay if something's wrong. I mean, I saw this video on YouTube the other day, and this guy had this brake job done on his car, and I mean, it wasn't attached to anything. I mean, it was so bad. I just couldn't believe that somebody did that. But he's probably not mechanically inclined. So when he bought the car, he didn't know that that brake line wasn't attached to anything, because he didn't know where to look. He didn't know what to see. So obviously being an A&P or having mechanical knowledge would be helpful when making an airworthiness determination. Let's see. I love flying, but I'm unemployed and financially in a career that they do not love. What would you do if you were in my shoes? That's a hard situation, because obviously finances are a big part of being able to follow your dreams. I hate to say it. I mean, there's no way around it. I can sugarcoat it and say, oh, if you have a dream and work hard, you're going to be there. Well, some way or another, you got to finance it. That's just, you know, the truth of the matter. I went into the military. That is a route that is available to other people. The only other option is to jump in and take those student loans out. That being said, if this is something that you love and you can qualify to do it, you can get a medical. There are financing options available in the United States that would allow you to complete your training. And in the end, it would give you a great return on investment. So if that's your situation, that's one way of doing it. The other thing too is find a mentor within aviation. I built so much time throughout my entire time flight training, because when I first started, I didn't make that much money. I built so much of my time flying at the local airport. Every Saturday morning, they had the West Side Airmen's breakfast. And I would go out there every single Saturday morning and sit down and smile and chat everybody up, and until somebody offered me to sit right seat in their airplane out for a lunch run. You know, I met an older gentleman, one of the best guys I ever know. He had a Champ, and the Champ was located 2 hours from where I lived. But, you know, he had issues with his medical and didn't qualify for light sports, so he needed somebody to fly with him to be PIC. And I put the gas in the tank, and I built so much time flying around for what the equivalent of $20 to $25 an hour. I built time in this Champ flying around. And guess what? I drove 2 hours each way. It was inconvenient. And, you know, I did exactly what it took. And I built all this time for a fraction of the cost. It's a lot of networking. It's a lot of doing, you know, giving up your weekend mornings to try to network. You know, go to the EAA events, go to, you know, Women in Aviation or your FAST team meetings, meet people. Because I still often have the back seat open in my Super Cub. You know, there's a lot of times that, you know, I'm out solo. And if somebody wanted to go and was standing there at the airport, I would have gladly have taken them. And I bet a lot of plane owners would say this as well. Let's see. Insurance possible for low timers. I already talked about that. When to say yes and when to walk away. It's a judgment call. Is it possible to join an experienced ferry pilot to gain experience? I did mention our internship program. A lot of pilots that want to get into this but don't yet have the experience going solo, we invite them to our internship program, and they can come along with our ferry pilots. We usually pair them with the flight instructor so they can receive flight instruction along on the ferries as part of our internship program. They would be responsible for their expenses, but they would be able to receive that instruction. Realistic number of yearly ferries, it just depends. Between all of us, I'd probably say we're ferrying about 150 a year. What gear do you carry? That depends on the mission. North Atlantic, that's a whole nother ball game. And domestically, that's still, I don't try to leave unprepared ever. You got to think, if you're flying over the Rocky Mountains and you have to land out somewhere, all you're going to have is what you have with you. And I mean, there was a funny poster I saw up in Fort Nelson in Canada. Was it Fort Nelson? I think it was Fort Nelson. And it had a picture of this guy walking in beach shorts and flip-flops through the snow. And the title of the poster from Transport Canada was, you know, be prepared if you have to make an emergency landing, right? If you're going to be flying over snow, it's probably not best to be wearing, you know, flip-flops and beach shorts, because that's not going to help you in an emergency. And, you know, talking to the Coast Guard, I've talked to them too about, you know, how to prepare if you're flying over water. And they say that most of their fatalities were completely preventable. You know, people go out in their sailboat and they think, oh, I'm just going to be gone for half an hour, and they drift off course. They don't have life vests. They don't have anything. And they're out in the middle of the water, they're getting rescued, or they drown. With just a little bit of preparation would have gone a long way. And so we take that into account. And, you know, oftentimes we carry survival kits in excess of what the requirement is. And we always try to dress and have food and water available for our environment. How to plan for Atlantic. I could probably do another whole video on that. Things that you didn't expect when you first crossed. Limited amount of services available. You can't get avgas in a lot of places in northern Canada. You really do have to bring your own fuel pump. And if you end up having to divert, you could get stuck there for a long period of time. There's no mechanics. Some places don't even have cell service. You know, you don't have any support. And in a lot of other countries, they don't even have FBOs. Like the idea that you could like pull up into a nice facility. I mean, they have these little terminals, but that doesn't exist outside of the United States. I mean, we have it so good here. You just don't have that in other countries. And so that kind of was surprising, is that, you know, I thought that aviation was like it is here in the US everywhere, and it's not. You know, you go out and you're on your own in a lot of these places, truly on your own. And you have to be self-sufficient enough to handle that. And I've been caught before, you know, not prepared. And guess what? It takes a long time to get back on track when that happens. So you got to be prepared. Let's see. Fuel container installation. We don't really do a whole lot of tanked ferries. We put hopper fuel in ag planes because it's already been plumbed for that. But otherwise, if you're going to be putting ferry tanks in an airplane, you either have to have an STC or a field approval. Those are the only two ways to do it legally. Like I said, ferry pilots have a bad reputation for not doing it legally, but that's how you would do it legally. Theoretically, though, if you can make about 487 miles with your plane, you can take it across without going too far out of your way. The shortest, if you really wanted to arrange for private avgas and do all this off-airport stuff, you could do 250 miles is all you need to get it across the North Atlantic. Let's see. Provider to use for plates and global maps. I personally use Jeppesen with ForeFlight. It's very expensive. I think I pay about $2,000 a year for North Atlantic, Europe, and South America. And I have ForeFlight Canada and ForeFlight US for Transport Canada charts, or Nav Canada charts, and also FAA charts here in the US. So that's what I use. Let's see. For communications, I mostly use my cell phone, but I also have an Iridium Go. It's kind of a very basic weather tool, but you can still use it for communication and email if you need to. Let's see. Already talked about the steps to plan a ferry flight and a pre-flight inspection of a mechanic. Yes and no. I turned down a ferry flight of an airplane a few days ago. It was purchased. I think it was a Cherokee 180. He paid $15,000 for it off the internet. Was out of annual, and nobody did a pre-buy inspection on it. And I said, well, we'd only be willing to do it if you put it in annual. If it was under other circumstances or had been annualed recently or done a pre-buy, we might have been willing to consider it. But, you know, we really do want to have had that airplane be looked at by a qualified professional within the preceding time frame, because those are usually the airplanes that cause us trouble. What's the one thing, experience, or tool that you wish you had earlier in your ferry career? I wish that I understood weather better when I started. You know, I had the basic training that they give you, but nobody ever sat down with me and told me about advanced weather. And I didn't even know about the grommet tool until like my 4th Atlantic crossing, which is what all the ferry pilots use for small planes across the Atlantic. So if I would have had those tools, I probably wouldn't have been stuck as much as I had, because I would have had a better idea of the weather instead of waiting for it to be cherry. And instead of waiting for it to be perfect, which happens so infrequently, they'll be waiting for a long time. People ask me, well, can I fly my plane to Europe? And I say, yeah, you can. But if you don't know what you're doing, then it's gonna take you a month to get there, because if you wait for the weather to be perfect every single leg, you'll never get there. So you gotta understand what's safe and make a judgment call on your own, because a lot of times it's marginal and it could go both ways. But once you get that experience and that knowledge of the weather and all the different tools, then you can often make it safely when the weather's not, when the skies aren't clear. Let's see. Do I still fly to work? I commute to work, yes. I have to jump on a United or a Delta flight or Spirit if I'm lucky. I know you say Spirit if I'm lucky. I love flying on Spirit. Absolutely love it as a crew member. Do I still fly to work? I have taken my Super Cub to the airport to fly to work before. Let's see. How do you ferry an aircraft that requires a type rating? If it requires a type rating, you're obviously gonna have to be type rated. In a lot of those airplanes, insurance is going to want you to have had recurrent training. I can't think of a single airplane without a type rating that insurance doesn't want to see a certain number of hours in type, as well as a recurrent training from flight safety or CAE or whatever it may be. Do we have a need for helicopter ferry pilots? No, I've been asked this before, and there's a lot of great ferry pilots out there who fly helicopters. It's just not that common. They just, it's just not enough business right now, at least for us, to justify trying to add helicopters to our insurance, because fixed wing and rotorcraft do not mix at all in the insurance world. And so it just doesn't justify it right now for that. That doesn't mean it's not going to change in the future, but we don't have, any need for that right now. Yep, somebody just said my right seat is open way too much. It's true. You go around at the airport, look at who's pre-flighting airplanes and how many people are by themselves. There's a guy who owns a Cirrus, right across from my hangar. And I've never seen him with another passenger, not once. And he'd probably be more than welcome, because he sits there and struggles with that thing getting in and out of the hangar. And I've gone over there to help him before. And I mean, there's so many people like that. They got an open seat. They just don't know how to fill it. And there's a lot of pilots out there thinking, man, I would love to fly with them and get that experience. And a lot of them are CFIs too. I met a guy at my home airport who has a Baron. And, he has a CFI. He's like, man, I'd love somebody to come with me and show him aviation. He could give you instruction for free in the Baron, free multi-engine instruction. He just doesn't know who to contact. But if you go there every Wednesday or every Saturday morning, maybe you'll meet that guy and make a connection. Do regional airlines allow flying outside? That's going to depend on the airline and the policy manual set forth by human resources, whether or not you can fly outside. Some airlines will just allow it, like ours does. Some of them will make you get chief pilot approval, and some of them will say not at all. So it just depends on who you're working for, but obviously you want to go by whatever their rules are. Some of them might, treat, Part 91 differently than 121 or 135, but you always want to consult with them first. Let's see. Well, I think that I don't have any more questions. I've answered most of everybody's questions. I hope this has been informative for you. Feel free to leave any feedback that you'd like, or if you have any other questions, feel free to message me directly. I know it's kind of a long video, but maybe I'll have to do another one sometime where I talk about the scary experiences, and that's something that you'd probably want to have over a glass of wine. So anyway, thank you for tuning in today, and I hope it's been informative. If there's anything that you'd like to message me about, I'd be more than glad to answer. Another thing that we do, especially for our newer pilots, is in addition to the scholarship program and the internship program, we also will review your resume for new commercial pilots. We're not doing airline apps or anything like that. But if you want, you can always send us your resume, and we can kind of go over that with you and maybe help you get your first flying job with that new commercial certificate. So feel free to reach out. You can find all the information on the Facebook page or the website. And thank you for tuning in. Have a great evening.